All right, hi everybody. Let me go ahead and check on my iPad here, make sure that everything's working. Here we go. All right, hi guys. How's everybody doing? I'm gonna wait a couple minutes for everybody to jump on, make sure that you guys can hear and see me all right before I start. Let's see. Perfect. All right, how you guys doing? Perfect. There we go. Oh, I see a couple people on there. Hi guys, can you guys see me okay? Audio working, camera working, everything good? Let me know in the comments, please. All right. Hi Sharon, how are you doing today? I'm so excited about today's live stream. We're going to be doing the Rocky Isomalt Waterfall project, which is a mixed medium project or mixed media project. So we're going to be using not just Isomalt, but some other fun techniques and mediums as well. Okay, awesome. Sharon says everything's working good. Fantastic. Hi Tina, how you doing? All right. Awesome, awesome. So we have about one more minute till 2 o'clock, but I'll wait another minute after that just for everybody to jump on before we start. Today is going to be a really, really fun project. So I can't wait to show you guys. Yay, thank you for all of the hearts. All right, right where you were watching from if you want to in the comments. That would be awesome to get to know each other a little bit. I am in Melbourne, Florida today, but it is not sunny Florida. It is very rainy Florida, so if you guys hear rumbling in the background, it decided to start thundering and raining about 10 minutes before I went live, of course, so if you hear any rumbling, it's just some thunder off in the distance. Hey, Sandy. Let's see. Hi, Davinia. Let's see, you got the Playdate kit, but I'll have to complete it later because graduation orders are hectic. I'm so glad that you're so busy. That's awesome. And I can't wait to see what you make afterwards. Definitely watching later. This will be available here on Facebook and on my YouTube channel where I list all of my past live stream projects. I just post the video on there so you can go back and watch as many times as you want. It makes it a little bit easier to see and to get to and search and everything. Hello, Kimberly from Utah. How are you doing? Hi, Heather. Hi, Cindy. Okay, awesome. We got a bunch of people on. Hi, Samantha. All right. Fantastic. So, we'll go ahead and get started here in just a minute. Awesome, awesome. Who is going to be following along today? Is anybody going to be following along live, or are you going to, watch first and then do it later, like Davinia said she was going to do? Let me know. You guys always know to post pictures, so if you're in the Simi Twitch team, our Facebook group, which is a free Facebook group for Isomalt lovers, make sure to post it in there, or if you post it on your page, make sure to tag me, because I would absolutely love to see you guys' interpretation of this project. I know it's going to be a good one. Hey, Karen. All right. Hi, Michelle. Michelle's in Galveston, Texas. All right. Okay, cool. So we will go ahead and get started with our project for today. Like I said, we're doing the Rocky Isomalt Waterfall. I do have the waterfall here. I can show you guys. Right here. Ta-da! So we have a bunch of different things going on here. We have the, of course, Isomalt focal point, which is the beautiful waterfall. I'm going to show you how to shape those, some little tips and tricks for water movement and things like that, and getting lots of texture in them, making them look really realistic, as well as making the pool of Isomalt underneath with the ripples. And then I'm going to show you also how to do all the rock textures. I love texture, so this is going to be a really fun one because we get to do all those fun rock textures. And then also a way to make some really pretty edible moss that's going to have that sheen to it. So we're going to have kind of like a wet look to the whole piece, which of course makes sense. If it's with a waterfall, maybe in a rainforest, I'm going to show you my technique for that, and then just painting and pulling everything together as well. So yeah, we're going to be making this project today, but of course you guys know if you're doing it at home, you can interpret it however you want and use the supplies that you have. We did have the accessory kit that went along with this project available on my website, which is still available, but you can also use what you have. Use the Isomalt you have, use whatever mediums you would like to mix and match with it, and yeah, just use what kind of paints and stuff you have, because it's always fun to be able to use all of the things that we collect as cake decorators, right, and cookie decorators. So definitely use what you got. But the supply list is available on my post about this and with the on my website too with the accessory kit. So if you want to see exactly what we're using, that is there. You guys know if you have any questions, please feel free to put them in the comments of the video. I have my iPad set up right here, which is where I keep looking to check on all of your comments if you have any questions. And then Mom is here too.
Hi everybody.
So she will be monitoring and shouting out any questions that I may have missed, or while I'm concentrating on what I'm making, she is going to be announcing all the questions you guys have. So make sure that you write them in the comments if you have any questions at all. Let's see, fantastic. Okay, cool, just making sure you guys are all doing good. All right, so yeah, we'll go ahead and start. Because this is going to be a multi-medium project or mixed media project, we're going to be actually starting with the fondant and Rice Krispie elements to this piece. So for the actual rocks, we need to make our rock base first before we can decorate on top of it with the Isomalt. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and flip my camera down so you guys can see what I'm doing. Here we go. There. All right, so we have our Isomalt here that we'll be using later. I'll talk a little bit more about that, but of course we're using Simi Isomalt tiles, so they're pre-cooked and ready to go. I did preheat those, but I'll have to reheat them a little bit later once we actually go into it, so I'll talk more about that then, but that is what we're using today. For the actual rocks, though, we're going to need to build those first, and now there's a few ways you can do that. Let me grab my example here to show you. Alright, so there's a few ways that you can do that. Again, we're going to kind of be just making this piece how I made it, but there's lots of different interpretations for how that you can make your own piece. So the rocks could actually be the cake part underneath if you're doing this part of a bigger project. You can use, just solid gum paste or fondant if you wanted to and just make it all completely, totally edible. You can also use, if this is just going to be a display piece, one thing that I use a lot of the time to build on top of is aluminum foil because it is food safe, but it's going to be a lot more lightweight. It's a lot more inexpensive than some of your mediums may be to do something solid. So I do use aluminum foil a lot. Which I'll talk about as we're shaping the rocks. But what I'm actually going to use today is going to be an edible, basically the edible equivalent of aluminum foil for sculpting. It's going to be Rice Krispie treats. So Rice Krispies are really, really nice for sculpting and for having things hold their shape really nicely because of course they're sticky and they're very, very lightweight, so they're not going to add too much weight to your piece. Since we are going to be using a lot of fondant and Isomalt heavy mediums with this, I just wanted something inside that's going to be really lightweight. But I'll talk about using different mediums as we go. But we're going to shape the rocks first. So I'll set this guy off to the side. All right, grab my work mat here. Yeah, I can go ahead and use this one. So I am going to actually be cheating today because I wanted to show you guys a really, really easy way to do this. I'm actually using Rice Krispie treats from the packet because they are very inexpensive. They're easy to just kind of pull out when you need them, keep them sealed until the time that you need them, and you can just mush them all together. So I just unwrapped a bunch to have them ready, and we'll start shaping. But of course, you can make your own Rice Krispies from scratch. It'll be even more cost effective, and it's really easy. It doesn't take very much time. If you're doing more like gravity-defying sculpting and really intricate, like bigger pieces, I usually add a little bit less butter and marshmallow to Rice Krispie, or I just add extra Rice Krispie cereal into it, and that will make it slightly tougher instead of it being more smushy, for lack of a better term. Instead of it being a softer texture with more of the marshmallow and the liquidy ingredients in it, I add more of the dry ingredient, which is the Rice Krispie cereal. But with this, because it's not really holding any sort of weight really, except for one little piece of Isomalt and some fondant, we're not going to worry about doing anything like that. But you could potentially, if you really wanted to, mix some dry cereal into this if you wanted, just to shape them a little bit differently. But I'm actually just going to use these as is because it just makes it really, really easy. And I'm just going to start by kind of mushing them together. So you can see I'm just pushing them together like this, and I'll do maybe one more sort of over here. So I'm pushing them all into kind of a vertical sort of shape, and then blending the edges and really trying to smush everything into one piece. Okay, and this is where we're going to start to make them look a lot more round. So if you notice on my finished sculpture, I had a little dip in the center where the waterfall is going to be coming out of, and I think that's really key with this, so it doesn't look like a wall. It looks really natural, and it looks like everything is just coming out of the rock rather than just sitting on top of it. So I'm actually going to add a slight dip into the very center here. I'll hold it this way so you can see it face up. So see how I'm just adding that little dip? Okay, so I use 6 of the little Rice Krispie treats to start with, but of course if you're making them from scratch, you just kind of keep adding pieces of it and pieces of it. And then I have a bunch more, but I have a couple more unwrapped that I'm actually going to split up and start just building a little bit on top. And I'm not going to put it directly on top because I want this to have some body to it and some width to it that's not just flat. So I put it kind of like on the front corner here, so it's protruding forward a little bit and not just sat on top. And that just elevates the side up a little and just exaggerates that angle that we got going. And I don't want it too perfect so it doesn't look completely symmetrical, since this is supposed to be nature. So I'm just going to kind of add little bits here and there, and for this shape that we're going for, it is going to be pretty circular. I'm going to do like a little circle pond since this is just going to be a standalone piece, but of course you can integrate this into the design of your cake or your sculpture or whatever you are using this for. You can really kind of do your own thing with it. I just want to create an area that I can pour the pool that's going to be encapsulated so the Isomalt has somewhere to sit. Okay, now this doesn't have to be perfect, we just want to kind of give it a base and then we're going to build on top of it with some fondant. Okay, so I'm just going to add little bits to the side. I'm just kind of ripping up and breaking up my Rice Krispie and just trying to make it kind of imperfect but also perfect, of course, because we want it to be perfectly imperfect. So I just kind of add little bits here and there, keeping in mind balance and making sure it doesn't look hugely off-center or anything like that, but I do want to just add in that little bit of texture. Maybe we'll add this piece down here. Alright. So see how I'm just kind of creating like a arch sort of effect here? The side's looking a little bit square still, so I'm just going to really squeeze that. The best part I like about Rice Krispies and sculpting is because they are puffs. They have air inside of them, so if you ever want to make something smaller, they just kind of crush together, and it gives you a lot of freedom to tweak things as you go. Awesome. Okay, so that's looking pretty good. We're going to keep going with this, but I'm actually going to stop with the Rice Krispies. I'm going to use my fondant instead. And the reason for that is that I want this to look a little bit thinner and smaller and have a little bit more detail to it. So what we'll do is start building now with our fondant, or you can use gum paste as well. I would not use modeling chocolate unless you are making the Isomalt pieces separately and then setting them on when they're cool, because of course chocolate and Isomalt melt at very different temperatures. If you try and pour the Isomalt directly into the chocolate, it's going to completely melt it and break it down. So fondant and gum paste are best for pouring Isomalt on top. And we do want to wait for them to dry a little bit too, will help, but you just want to make sure if you are using modeling chocolate, you make all of your pieces separate, maybe on a model or something that you can then transfer them into the exact shape. So you could potentially, if you really wanted to cover this in modeling chocolate, you can make a pretty much identical shape in aluminum foil or something like that, and then build your waterfall on there, and then you can transfer it over. You may have to use some rocks and things to kind of fill it in, but you could do it that way if you wanted, and then just pour a free-form disc to set the whole thing on top of Isomalt rather than filling it in like we're going to be. I like this just because I can make it look a little bit more organic and a little bit more realistic, but you see I kind of made like the back of an armchair sort of look, if the back of an armchair was cut off. And now I'm going to start building on top of it with my fondant. So I'm going to go ahead and just set this guy off to the side for a second. If you were working with warm Rice Krispies, you would want it to cool, of course, before you put the fondant on top so that you don't get any moisture or heat attached to the fondant, but these are already cool. If you need to reshape this at any point and it got too hard, or maybe when you buy your Rice Krispies they're not the softest, or even when you make them, if you made them a little dry, you can just lightly put this in the microwave for like 5 seconds at a time, maybe only even 2 or 3 seconds if you have a strong microwave, and it will just warm everything up and make it more pliable to shape. And then once it cools back down to room temperature, it'll be nice and hard again, which is one of my favorite tips with Rice Krispies, is to get the texture different. Let's see. Teresa says, about how wide and high are your Rice Krispies before covering it with fondant? That's a very good question. Let me measure it. I'm just kind of going by eye, so I'm not doing any specific thing, but this is 6 inches wide at the widest point across, so I'm aiming for like a 6-inch cake topper. So this is 6 inches wide, and then the height of it is about 3 inches tall, but that really is personal preference. This is the size of the one that I showed you before, the finished example, but you could change that up as much as you wanted to. Just will need a little bit more Isomalt if you're going to do it a lot bigger. Okay, that guy goes off to the side. And now we're going to grab our fondant. So I'm just working on a separate mat from my Isomalt mat. You can see I laid this plastic mat on top that I can cut on and not worry about getting the grease anywhere. And I have some fondant here. This is satin ice fondant, so I just mix some black and white together to make a nice gray tone. Again, that's all personal preference depending on what kind of rocks you are planning to build on. I also did put in a little bit of Tylose into this. Now that's not necessary. You can just use regular fondant and just let it dry a little bit longer, but for demonstration purposes I wanted to put some Tylose in it just so that it dries a little bit faster and a little bit harder. So I'm just re-softening my fondant first. I like using satin ice fondant because it works really, really good here in Florida where it's so humid, especially today. I don't know if you can hear that rain, but it is raining outside. It has been for the past day or two, so I want to just make sure that it's going to hold up well, but of course you can use the fondant of your choice. Alright, I know for sure that satin ice will not melt or break down from the heat of Isomalt, but depending on what's in your fondant, if you're using like a chocolate fondant or something, you may just want to do a test separate from your piece to make sure that your fondant is going to hold up. But generally, just straight fondants and gum pastes are going to be good. Alright, so what we'll do first is we are going to cover our rocks, and then we're going to build on top of it with more rocks to create the little border for the pool. So I'm just going to grab a little bit of vegetable shortening to put on my mat here. So I'm just using a little bit of Crisco, and just putting that down so that it makes it easier to roll out. I'm not going to need all of this. I'm going to take some of it away. Wrap that back up. Alright. And the really fun part about making rocks is that they're not perfect. So you don't even have to get all these creases out of your fondant if you don't want to. It's all going to add to the rock texture. So you'll notice with this that I'm kind of purposely being a little bit messy because I want it to give as much natural texture as it can. You can see when I was mixing the colors together, I didn't even really make sure that the colors were totally mixed because that'll just add to the variegation of the finished piece. Okay, so I'm just rolling this out into a piece big enough that will cover our Rice Krispies. And you can use a little bit of icing or piping gel or something on your Rice Krispies if they're not sticky enough to cover and the fondant stick, but I am not going to have to do that because it is a sticky day outside and my Rice Krispies are fresh. I just took them out of the package, so they're very sticky.
Michelle said that she just found the satin ice has the tropical fondant.
Yeah, satin ice just came out with a tropical fondant for high humidity areas, and I'm so excited. I actually just got some in to try it, and I can't wait. I played a little bit with it yesterday, and it was incredible, so super duper excited about that.
Today's a good day to try it.
Today is a good day to try it, yeah. It is pouring, pouring rain outside. Alright, so you can see how I'm seeing some of the texture of the Rice Krispies through the fondant. Now if you didn't want that, of course you would need to crumb coat it or use a little bit of royal icing or something on the outside so that you kind of spackle it over to smooth it, but I want that look because of the rocky nature of this piece, so I'm just going to go with it. Alright, so I'm just covering like I would a normal cake, just pulling out any creases or anything like that, and then we'll just grab our X-Acto knife. Again, I am working on a plastic mat that can be cut on. You don't want to cut on your silicone mat. Okay. And just roughly cutting out the big pieces. And again, this could be cake if you wanted to. You could pour the put the Isomalt right onto it and then make a border out of gum paste or something to hold the little pool, or you can set it on top of the pool instead. Okay, the nice part about this not being cake is I can just pick it up. Now, if I was going to do this out of foil instead, the process would be exactly the same, but you probably would want to put some piping gel or icing or something on the outside of them just so it sticks. I like to use foil tape to stick all of my pieces of foil together because since they're not sticky, they don't always like to stick together. They like to fall apart sometimes. So I just take a little piece of foil tape, which you can get at the hardware store, and just use that to attach everything together. Alright. There we go. So there is my basic rock shape. You can see I have a little bit of Rice Krispies showing that I'll just cover, but we're going to cover that with the waterfall anyway. And now I'm going to wrap up my extra pieces of fondant really quick. And then we're going to start adding rocks and adding texture. I want to add the texture first because I did put some Tylose in this and I don't want it to dry too much before I start putting all the texture in this rock, because you could leave it like that, but I feel like I could use more. So to add some more texture, I'm going to use some aluminum foil. This is just regular aluminum foil. Okay, the more that you crumple it and press it together, the different effects you're going to get, if it's a looser press or not. And then I'm also going to use some of my sculpting tools and just start looking at some of the areas and creating indents. So if there's like a section that looks more rounded or like a chunk that was stuck on, I may accentuate that a little bit with my sculpting tool. Flip it so you can see. Okay. And then just keep adding some creases. Again, I'm not really being too precise with this or too neat with this because I just want to add to the kind of craggly surface. So you can already see how that looks a little bit more accentuated. And then I'll go over with my foil, and the foil is really going to help when we start to add the rock border on, because it's going to blend everything together. So I'm going over places multiple times, and I'm just going to add this to the entire thing. If you feel like it's cutting into the fondant a little too much, you can just go back over and smooth it slightly and dull it out with your hand, or with a fondant smoother or a rolling pin, or even a big ball tool would work. Okay, so see how I'm just imprinting this entire thing. And then it looks a little bit flat right now, but as we keep adding texture, and then later when we dust it, that's really where it's going to come to life. I'm not worrying too much about the back for this piece since it's just a display. Okay, then I'm going to start adding some really deep indents into the whole thing. Adding a whole bunch of texture, just so that it looks more like separate pieces of rock all pushed together than one blob that was covered. Kind of want to trick the eye, so I'm just creating kind of circular shapes. I'm not doing anything straight with my tool. Whenever I make a line, I'm making sure it curves, just because the shape of rocks that I'm emulating have that sort of curviness to them. Okay, so you can see the sides where I put a lot more creases, and then the areas where I didn't, how much of a difference it makes.
Jackie says they've had 2 days in South Florida of a lot of rain.
Oh, a lot of rain.
Yep.
Hopefully it's moving on up here, because it hasn't rained in a long time here.
Emily says it's the opposite in Salt Lake. It's hot and dry.
Oh.
Summertime.
Yep. Alright, so see how I'm just adding a whole bunch of texture. I'm actually going to grab, well, actually this one looks good. I was going to grab a new piece of foil and crumple it a little bit looser, but I found a spot on there that's not crumpled quite as much, so I just kind of soften out some of those marks. And you can use different textures, or different mediums for this texture too. You can crumple up paper, you can crumple up wax paper, you can crumple up plastic wrap, and all of the different thicknesses of them and the different just textures of them will give you different textures too. Even if they're all crumpled the same way, they're going to be different levels of hardness and different levels of kind of indent that it'll give you. Okay, and I would just continue doing this until I'm happy with it. You can stop here, you can keep going. I'm pretty happy with how that's looking, so we're going to start adding some of our little rocks, and then we'll blend everything together. Now I'm going to switch this onto the mat that I'm going to be pouring. Since I'm not going to be letting this dry all the way, I want to make sure that I don't have to move everything once I have it all together. So I'm going to actually move that onto my non-stick Teflon mat. You can also do this on a piece of non-stick aluminum foil or regular aluminum foil that has been greased with cooking spray and then lightly just wiped over. For the rocks that we're going to make the ring, I'm going to actually use our rock texture mold. I absolutely love this mold. It is so much fun, and it gives you so many different shapes. So we're going to use that to piece everything together. And it just makes it a lot easier so that you can get variation, because we all know when we make rocks, we want to make perfect rocks, right? Our brains want to tell us to make perfect rocks, and sometimes they can come out looking too perfect, or they can come out looking too kind of standardized. So I like to use a rock mold like this because it already has different shapes, and it's going to make me make them in different shapes. Plus, it's very quick because all you have to do is press in the texture and then peel it out. So you can see even in this humid day I didn't even grease or powder the mold. All I did was just press it in. And I do kind of mimic the shape of the rock before I press it in. So like when I am pressing in this rock, I see that this side's wider and this side is a little bit skinnier. So I'm just going to make my piece that I'm pressing in like that first. If I press in way too much, what I'll do is I will pinch it all to the center. So I'm pushing down with my fingers and pushing together to create a little ridge like that. And then I'll just cut that off with scissors instead of using a palette knife or an X-Acto knife to cut over the top, because I find that that's way too risky that you're going to cut your mold.
And all those rocks were molded from Grandpa's village under his Christmas tree. All the rocks he made by hand.
Yeah.
We molded all of his rocks for this.
Yeah, this mold is definitely really special because he had a huge village at Christmas time and made all of the rocks by hand, you know, for each individual place that he needed them. So we really, really love this mold, especially for that, because it's all of his rocks in all the different shapes. So it just makes it really special. So see how I'm just making a variety of rocks first, and then I'll start to put them together. Okay. Just pressing it in, kind of using my finger to pull away like big chunks of excess at first. There we go. And I don't worry about cleaning up the edges or anything because, again, they're rocks. They're not supposed to look too perfect. So just pushing that into all the crevices, and you can go as rock crazy as you want. I'm just pretty much going to be making enough to make my ring around the outside, but you can add more towards the center if you want before you pour so that they look like they're submerged. You can also just push in half pieces of the rock, so if you have a shape that doesn't quite match any of these, what you can do is I'm just going to pour into part of it, and because these are so rough, you're not going to be able to tell where it was supposed to end. So see how I'm just pressing in part of the mold and not the whole thing, and then it just pops right out. And now we'll start, because I want to try and get an idea of how many more I'm going to need. I'm just going to start putting them together first. I don't attach them at first because I want to make sure that it's all going to fit how I want it to. So I try and choose rocks that are a little bit different next to each other. And again, they're not really going to want to stay at first, but that's okay, because we're just getting an idea of where they're going to go. Okay, so see how I just started that? I can see that I kind of want to layer these a little bit different so that the shape is slightly more rounded. And that's why I lay them out first instead of attaching them as I go. Okay, I'm pretty happy with that sort of basic shape. That'll give us enough room for our waterfall. So just to keep them from moving around on me as I go, I'm going to take a little bit of piping gel. So I'm just using some piping gel that is a piping gel that dries. It does dry pretty hard, so it'll keep everything together. And just grab a paintbrush and start putting those together. You could use royal icing or even chocolate, as long as you don't have any of it exposed to where the ice melt's going to touch. Okay, so I'm just putting a pretty generous glob of it in between each rock. And then, of course, once this all dries, the fondant dries and the piping gel dries, it would hold together on its own, but the Isomalt is really, really going to help it to stick together as well. Okay. So see how I'm just using that as a glue, and then I'll go back and add a little bit more onto the whole thing. Oops. Did I freeze? There we go. I think we're back. I don't know if that was just my computer freezing or if it was the internet, but I just basically put some glue at each of those joints, and then I'm going to build on top of that with more rocks, because right now it just looks a little bit flat, and we want to make sure everything's going to tie together really nicely. Alright. So I'm just going to maybe do some smaller rocks, because I always start with bigger ones, and then I layer on top of that with smaller pieces, just to give me an idea of where it's all going to go. And I'm going to be mindful of the joints as well, especially blending into the big back rock. You could just take the rock molds and use that to cover each one, each spot on the Rice Krispies if you wanted to. That sometimes can get a little bit thick unless you make your pieces purposely concave, which you totally could do. by just using less fondant that you need and kind of creating like an indent in the center. But I'm just going to blend the two together instead. But that's totally up to you and kind of how you want it to be shaped. So see, I'm just randomly selecting different spots on my mold and then making pieces in different shapes. Okay. Alright. So just adding little bits of glue here and there. And then I will start to put some rocks up on the Rice Krispie base because you can see that the texture is a little bit different between the two. So I want to really blend it together and make it look seamless, like it's all made out of the same kind of rock. So what we'll do is start sort of building up onto the base itself. And then you can even go around and blend the edges, because right now you kind of have a line and a seam around the whole thing. So I had a crease already that I had indented before. So I'm just going to go through. Even if I don't get rid of the seam altogether, I am almost sometimes accentuating it so that it looks more purposeful than accidental, like you didn't blend it in all the way. And then you can even go through and add a little bit of the texture that we added onto the rock base with the foil in any spots that maybe was a smoother area on the rock, or maybe you accidentally smoothed over with your fingers as you were putting it together. And that's just going to help it all to look cohesive. Okay, so just blending, blending, blending. Continuing to add more and more. I'm going to add, I feel like this little spot here is kind of moving around on me a lot, so it looks a little bit weaker. So I'm going to put another piece of rock on top of it as like a little band-aid. Just to join the two together. And then maybe I'll put a rock or two on the base before we let this dry up. Okay, so I'm going to do slightly bigger ones since this is a bigger section of rock. We can have some more large details rather than the teeny tiny little details of the tiny rocks. And this will also help to kind of push out some areas, so again it looks a lot more textured and has more depth to it rather than it being too flat. And I just smooth some of the seams, any that kind of look like they don't belong, between the fondant on the base and the fondant of the rock, and then go through and just re-texture it a little if it needs. And you see how that just pulled that rock out so much. Instead of it looking a little bit flat like this side, it just really, really pulls the whole thing out and makes it look more cohesive to the little rocks over here. So again, up to you if you want to use the rocks to cover the entire thing, or if you want to cover it with a flat piece first and then go back and add like I am. There's different interpretations of it, of course. Everybody's going to like a little bit different style. I'm trying not to put any three-dimensional rocks in the center because I want that to purposely look like it's indented for the waterfall to sit there. So the less texture there, the better, because it'll make all the other texture really pop if it's a lot more raised than the middle. There we go. Alright, so I'm pretty happy with that. I'll hold that up sideways so you guys can see before we pour. And then I'm just going to clean up any little pieces of fondant that are in the center, because those are going to be caught in the water if we don't. Okay, so normally I would let this dry as much as possible, so if you're planning to do this later, you may want to just give that like a couple hours, or depending on your humidity, even longer if you really want to cement it in place. It shouldn't necessarily melt it if you poured it right away, but it has just a better look to it, I find, if you let this dry a little bit before we move on. But just for time's sake, I'm going to go ahead and heat up my Isomalt to get it ready. So first I'll just clean up a little bit, because we want to make sure that all of our Isomalt is going to be separate from our fondant, because we don't want to get any grease or anything like that into the Isomalt. I saw one more little spot run. I want to put a rock right here before I continue. This is another one of those techniques, guys, where you're just going to want to keep adding one more rock and one more rock and one more. But with this, I find the more the better. It just adds so much depth. There we go. All right, wrapping up my fondant. Okay, so just wrap up my excess gray. Away my Crisco. And of course, you can work at your own speed. That's the beauty of this, that everybody's in their own kitchen. So if you want to go rock crazy, keep going. You can watch the rest of the demo while you work, and then when you get to the next step, you're ready for it. But I'm just going to go ahead and start heating my Isomalt. I had already preheated it a little bit, so it's kind of warm to start. But generally, when you're heating up Isomalt, you want to go 30 seconds and then 15-second intervals until it is a liquid. I'm using the our light blue Isomalt, the one that we have pre-colored. It came with this accessory kit if you got that, or you can color it with edible airbrush colors. Airbrush colors are going to be the best for making translucent water-like finishes in your Isomalt because it's going to be see-through. I'm going to wipe up my hands. Of course, you guys can go wash your hands to get all the grease off of it, but I'm just going to wipe them up really quick, get all the excess oil off from the Crisco. I didn't really use very much because I find with the satin ice in my climate, it really doesn't need very much. I don't like to use powder, but you could, depending on your fondant and your humidity. You can use cornstarch to keep the stickiness away, but I really like the vegetable shortening with satin ice fondant because it is a little bit on the firmer side, so it just really conditions it beautifully. But of course, everybody's going to be a little different with their climates. Alright, so I'm going to try and hold this up so you guys can kind of see it before I pour. Of course, it's still sort of pliable, but that's what we got going so far. So you see the really cool texture and depth that we got with the adding the rocks on the outside. And it's not totally perfect. Of course, you can build it around like a metal cookie cutter or something if you wanted an exact shape to make it easier on yourself, or put a template or something under it and then pull it out before you pour the Isomalt in, of course. But I'm just going to kind of do it by eye. Alright, so I'm just melting my Isomalt. Of course, you do want to be careful because Isomalt is about 300 degrees, so you do not want to touch it. I'm using my Simi Isomalt tiles. They're pre-cooked and ready to use, so you don't have to worry about temperatures or recipes or anything. You just melt it down. Wearing your gloves, of course, because Isomalt's very hot, so it's about 350 degrees. Definitely wear your gloves, but it's just like working with an oven or a stovetop. You get used to it, you get more comfortable with it. Just make sure you're wearing your gloves. Don't follow my bad example of not wearing gloves, but my hands have no heat sensitivity left from working with this for about 14 years. So usually I recommend, though, a cotton glove and then a nitrile or latex glove doubled up on top of that, and that will buffer the heat from your hands. We are going to be pulling this as well as pouring it today, so we are going to have some contact with it. Alright, so I'm just heating this up until it gets to a nice boil. Now, bubbles don't necessarily look bad in this because it is supposed to look like the water is all churned up and bubbly from the waterfall pouring in, but if you want it to get that really nice crystal clear pool look, you want to make sure that you boil all of the air out first by bringing it to a boil, which I believe it is at now. Perfect. Okay, so see how I have a beautiful boil going on, the bubbles are all moving and popping, but we don't want to pour that right away because those bubbles will get stuck in your Isomalt and freeze there and you'll see them. So I'm just going to put this off to the side for just a minute or two at room temperature, and hot air rises, so any air that was mixed in will all rise to the surface and it will pop, and then you'll be left with crystal clear Isomalt. So I do make sure that I don't stir the Isomalt while it is melting because you don't want to mix in excess air. It's not like chocolate that needs the agitation. It is going to be just fine by itself until it comes to a boil, and that way you don't mix in any extra air. But if you have to mix it to mix in your color or your flavoring, all you have to do is re-microwave it, bring it back to a boil, and all that air you mixed in will rise out. So you definitely can color it yourself if you have clear already, or you have, maybe a green that you want to turn teal or something. That would be pretty depending on your color palette. So yeah, we're just letting that sit. And you can also flavor this. Oil-based flavorings work best. Just a drop or two is all you need. It's very, very potent. So you can flavor it if you want to. Just again, remember if you have to mix it, that you go back and you re-boil it afterwards. All right. We're going to pour our pool first, and then while the pool is cooling, we'll make the actual waterfall, the 3D part, with the pulling techniques rather than pouring it. But I'll go over a couple different ways that you could do this. So you can see it has calmed down a lot. I still have one or two bubbles that are just moving and popping, so I want to wait to make sure that the Isomalt has cooled. and then we're going to pour it right into the center. So again, I'm pouring on a non-stick Teflon mat because I know that that will release, but you can also use a piece of non-stick foil just by itself, or you can use a piece of regular aluminum foil, but it has to be greased with cooking spray. You could potentially pour it right on a silicone mat, but with big pieces, flat pieces like this, it sometimes can bubble up from the heat and get a little bit wavy underneath. So I use something very lightweight like this because it can just push the Isomalt or the mat down, and it kind of holds it flatter. Alright, there we go. So I have my nice melted but calm Isomalt. You can see it's still really liquidy. I can pour it easily, but it's not going to, be too thick to pour in either.
Michelle would like to know what could you use if you wanted to make a tiny little sand beach inside?
Oh, I love that idea. That would be really pretty. You can pour it over brown sugar if you want to. If the Isomalt is going to be poured on top of it, you may want to let the Isomalt sit really well before you pour it and be more of a syrupy consistency so it doesn't melt the sugar. But for even more of a sandy texture, I would pour the whole water area first, then go back on top of it with brown sugar, or you can use like crushed up graham crackers or whatever kind of sand that you like, and you can attach it on with piping gel to create that realistic sand finish. But if you wanted it underneath, I think that as long as you let the Isomalt cool pretty well, so it's very, very thick and not so hot, you could pour it right on top of the sugar. Just make sure you never melt that back down, because the sugar mixed in with the Isomalt will affect the texture of it and not allow it to harden and everything, just because the sugar is not tempered like the Isomalt is. Alright, so this is perfect now. We're just going to pour just enough to cover the bottom, but of course you could pour it as deep as you wanted to. And I just start in one spot and let it run out. And touch the fondant or gum paste or whatever you're using. There we go. And then I give that just a minute because, again, hot air rises, so sometimes you'll get a couple stray bubbles. You can see I have a few. So I want them to all rise up to the surface, and after a minute or so, I can go ahead and pop those with the torch, or you can leave them and you can just give it another layer of dimension that it will look totally intentional with the waterfall look of it. So I'm making sure I'm not melting my fondant. I'm just turning the torch down pretty low so that I can control it, and just very lightly going over the entire surface to pop any bubbles. If you had a lot of like little cracks and crevices that maybe the Isomalt doesn't want to spread by itself, you can use a silicone tool or a toothpick and just spread it into any areas, but it looks like it went into everywhere I need it to for this, since I didn't do a whole bunch of like little streams or anything coming off of it. Alright, now we're just going to let that cool. So at room temperature, that will cool in probably about, I would say 20 minutes or so. So I'm just going to slide that out of the way and let that guy cool down. So easy as that to pour Isomalt in. You can pour it directly onto a fondanted cake if you wanted it attached, rather than having this like it's free moving, so you can take it on and off as needed. But it will hold up beautifully. Okay, so we'll just let that guy cool off. Alright, so next we are going to pull the Isomalt so that we have it all into more of a clay form that we can sculpt, and that's how we're going to do the waterfall. You could potentially pour liquid Isomalt for a waterfall. It'll be a lot flatter though. It won't really have much definition to it. You could let it cool and then pour more and let it cool to get kind of like a drippy effect on top, but it's a lot harder to control. You can't really shape it how you are going to want to, so this is going to give you a lot more depth. The thing with waterfalls is there's tons of depth to them because they're water that's falling, so there's air incorporated into it, and it looks a lot thicker and a lot more kind of round than it actually is if you were to take the water and just have it, kind of sliding down. Think of like a babbling creek with the water sliding over the rocks, compared to a waterfall where the water is actually out in the air rather than just sliding down the side of something. So you can get the different effects, but it just kind of depends on what you're going for. Today we're going for a big energy-filled waterfall. Alright, so I'm going to pour the Isomalt out, so I'm using the same exact light blue Isomalt. I'm just going to pour it out onto my silicone mat. I haven't greased it or powdered it or anything, and I'm just going to start to fold it. So I'm going to just fold it over and then peel it back, fold it over, and then peel it back. This is just incorporating cool air into the Isomalt, and what's going to happen is it'll all thicken and come together, and then it will start to turn into a clay, kind of like dough. When it's ready, it all pulls together. So I'm just kind of pulling, folding, and I'm making sure that I'm lining the edges up to the opposite edge when I fold it over. So this line is lining up with this edge over here, so it's not stopping before it, it's not going past it. I'm just folding it directly in half, slowly. You don't want to flick Isomalt anywhere. Alright, let's see. Jackie says maybe we can also use the wave mold and take it out before it's completely hard to give it the shape. You could absolutely do that. Yeah, I'm going to talk a little bit about shape when we go into actually making the piece for the waterfall, but it does have a very similar shape if you stretched it and tweaked it a little bit. That would be super pretty, and it already has all of the definition and the texture in it. Alright. So see how I'm just continuing? I'm going slow because, again, I don't want to splatter it, but as it starts to cool, I will go faster. Now, one thing I want to do is I want to just move it over every few folds so that the table has time to cool off. The Isomalt, of course, is very hot, so it insulates a lot of heat, and I want to make sure that it is going to release easily from the silicone mat, because silicone has pores just like skin, so from heat they can open up, and it can actually cause the Isomalt to stick down into the pores and get caught in there if it's too hot. So I want to make sure I'm letting it cool off. That's another reason I have this other silicone mat underneath the one I'm working on, because it just helps to buffer the heat from my metal table and not get too hot. Okay, I'm pulling back a little bit faster now because it is getting thicker, so I know it's not going to actually splatter. Okay, so as it gets cooler and cooler, it's going to release easier, and you do want to go faster as soon as you can, as soon as it feels more like a solid, because you want to make sure it is going to release really easily. Ooh, don't want to bump my rock there. It is going to release a lot easier, and not risk over pulling it as well, because the more air you fold in, the harder and harder the texture will get. I'm just going to move it over to my really cool spot on my table here for a second. There we go.
Sydney, I'm sorry I walked away for just a second. Did you see Jackie's question about the wave?
Yes, yeah, that's what we were just talking about, that it's a very similar shape. I think that would be really pretty.
Beautiful. Sorry.
No, you're good. Alright, so see how it is not sticking as much as it was before, right? It is a lot more of a clay, and it's pulled together so that I know when I can pick it up easily with my gloved hands that you are going to be able to sculpt with it. But right now it's still a little bit too soft, so you can see it's still sticking, and it's not really going to hold any shape. So we do want to thicken the texture a little and harden it slightly by pulling in more air. So I'm going to stretch and fold in some more air as soon as it is able to be handled and it's not just sticking and falling all over the place. So I like to just roll it in between stretching and folding, and it creates that beautiful sheen. And it also creates these streaks and striations. So every time you fold it, you're folding in more air, and it's the bubbles that are creating those streaks, and that's actually going to help us a lot. So along with any pulling, but especially this, we want to make sure we're only folding in one direction. You're not twisting it up or kneading it, because having that sort of streakiness and those lines going straight down is really going to help just add depth into the entire piece, since that's sort of the texture we're going to be adding on top. So just continuing to stretch and fold, and you'll feel the harder the texture gets, the more air you pull into it. So that's kind of up to you what you like to work with, if you like to work with something more pliable or a little bit firmer. But it also gets that beautiful satin finish the more air that you put into it. So I'm going to go ahead and stop there. Okay. So now I am going to put it underneath my heat lamp. So the heat lamp is going to be a 250 watt bulb. So it's very, very hot, and it will keep the Isomalt warm there as long as you leave it underneath. So the Isomalt will just get kind of crumpled into a ball. It doesn't need to be pretty, you just want to make it more compact, because if you leave it in more of a tube, the ends could get warmer or cooler and the center can stay warmer. So I try and just kind of crumple it up so that it's more compact into a circle, and I'll set that under the brightest part of the lamp. So again, that is just going to be basically keeping it warm so I can just cut pieces off. Now, you don't have to have the lamp. If you don't have one, it's okay. You can just start making your piece and start shaping it. And as needed, you can re-soften this a little bit, so I can actually put the entire ball of Isomalt that I just pulled onto my silicone mat. I fold it in half, and I just pop it in the microwave for 5-second intervals only. And what that's going to do is it's just going to soften it and reanimate it a little bit so that you can continue working with it. But you want to be careful, because the microwave is going to be uneven heat, so you don't want to just pick it up out of the microwave. You fold it again on the mat, make sure there's no liquidy spots or anything hiding in the center, get it all back to a balanced texture, and then you can go ahead and start hand pulling it if you need to add a little bit more coolness to it and a little bit more air. So you can totally do that. Just go ahead and start sculpting it. I like the lamp because it's just going to keep it a little bit warmer. I have more time to work with it. I don't have to worry about keeping my Isomalt warm. So it's just a 250 watt heat lamp bulb. So you can get that from like the hardware store, or animal supply stores have them usually. And then it's a hood for like chickens and reptiles. So it's very inexpensive. It usually comes with the clamp. It's about 15 bucks for both parts all together, the bulb and the hood. And then I recommend just clipping it to your overhead cabinet. If you're working on your countertops, you can just open the door and clamp it to the side. Or I have a YouTube video on my channel, which is just under my name, Sidney Galpern, and you can get it through my website too, simicakes.com, and that shows the exact stand design that I have, and how to put it together and everything, and the height that I usually like it. From the surface of the Isomalt to the surface of the bulb is usually about 8 to 10 inches, but I create chains with zip ties so that I can have different kind of options, so I can hang it higher or lower on the chain depending on the temperature of the room, if I'm under a draft, and especially you know, when I'm traveling and teaching, I want to make sure that I can accommodate for any weather, and even just day to day the weather changes, right? Alright, so that's all pulled and ready to go. Did anybody have any questions? Alright, looks good, looks good. Okay. So next up we are going to be pulling our waterfall. So with waterfalls, the shape of it is going to be really important because you want to make sure that it's going to look realistic, like water. And water does a few specific things as it pours. So I'm going to grab my other piece here. Now, of course, this is art. No one can tell you that art is wrong, so it's really up to you how you want to shape it. If you want to look up some inspiration pictures of waterfalls, that can be really helpful. You know, just having those sort of reference photos for different shapes, depending on the type of rocks and things that you're using. But basically, we're just going to create a pulled base over this, and then we're going to add this texture of these lines on top afterwards. So we're just creating the base at first, so don't stress too much about making it perfect. One thing that water does do is at the base of it, it's going to start going outwards a little bit. I didn't do that too much with this one because it's a very short fall, but if you look at the top compared to the base of most waterfalls, they're going to be wider at the base and a little bit smaller at the top, because again, when the water is more condensed as it's just flowing over the rocks, it's going to be flatter, but when it's falling down, it's kind of pushing air into it as it goes downwards, if that makes sense. So it's going to be a little bit wider at the base than it is at the top, which you can see a little bit here compared to down here where it starts to spread out and everything. Okay, so I'll just give you kind of a look of that before we start. Okay, and then on the back of it, you can see that I just cut it off, but of course you could keep that going, or you can have that go to wherever your design calls for, but since this piece is really only going to be viewed from the front, I just kind of had it falling off into the distance. Okay, so with that in mind, we will check on our base, making sure that that is totally together and cool. I just put my fan on it the last few minutes to make sure, since I am going a little faster than normal for demonstration purposes. Yeah, this is all solid. It's okay if it's a little warm because it'll actually stick better to it, but you don't want this to be too hot or pliable or anything like that at all when you go to put everything together. So I'm going to leave it. I'm not going to remove the bottom mat yet, just because it is still cooling a little bit, but what we're going to do is just create a base to flow over the rocks first.
Sid, Michelle would like to know if you have a ripple effect in the pool.
Yes, we are going to have a ripple effect, and I will show you how to do that after our waterfall's on, because I really like to customize it to the way that the water is falling of exactly where you put it. So we will do the ripples. Okay, so first up, again, we're just making a base, so don't stress too much about it. We're going to build on top of it a lot. My Isomalt did melt back down a little bit under the lamp because it is slightly warm in here, but if you already have a good texture to start with, you can just cut a piece off. You don't have to stretch and fold it by default every time. I do want a fairly solid and hard texture for this because I don't want it sagging. Since this is a vertical shape, you don't want the weight of it pulling down too much. You want it to hold in place where you put it. Okay, I'm going to take probably about at least half, if not 2/3 of the Isomalt that I had left. The excess smaller piece is going to go under the lamp, and then this one I'm going to first roll and stretch as a tube. I'm not going to flatten it too much to begin with because I don't want it to flatten too much and cool too much. When it's in a tube, it holds more heat than if it's a flat piece. So I'm first just rolling it and kind of getting an idea of where to put it and how big to make it, but don't touch it to anything because the warmth will make it stick to the fondant and to the Isomalt. Okay, then what we're going to do is just flatten it slightly. I'm not doing too much because I still want a lot of body to it like I was talking about. I'm just flattening it and maybe pressing down at the base, so I'm pushing it down and then stretching it out slightly. The key with this is not pinching it too hard and moving your fingers around a lot because, again, you don't want to get rid of the thickness of it. You still want it to be a good like 1/2 inch to an inch thick. Okay, so see how I'm making a very, very subtle kind of wider end to this whole thing? Okay, making sure it still fits within my rocks. Alright, so you can even concave the back a little bit if you wanted to add more height, but maybe your piece got a little too flat. You can kind of concave and bow it so that there's an indent going up the back. You can even press your rolling pin into that if you want, and that will add even more depth because you won't be able to tell if it's solid once it's on the piece. Alright, and this is our moment of truth. This is where we got to decide exactly where it's going because once it's stuck, it is stuck. So I'm just going to set it pretty much flush back to the rocks on the base and then wrap it up the top. I did not heat or anything because my base is still a little warm, but if your base, the pool is not warm, you can just heat it a little. The fondant will stick regardless, so you don't have to add any extra glue unless you really, really want to cement it on there. You could pour a little liquid Isomalt or heat up the back of the Waterfall with the torch first if you wanted to. Okay, so that's what we got first. So I just laid it right on top. Before this sets up too much, I am going to add a couple little indents just so that we're working on a slightly textured base. Okay, you can use your silicone tools, or sometimes what I find is easier is to use a more rigid tool for bigger pieces like this. So I'm going to use my little baby palette knife, or you can use like a butter knife or paring knife, and just add some ridges going all the way across the top and down the back, trying to keep them pretty straight up and down vertical. Okay. And you want to make sure you follow through all the way to the back of the piece because you want it to look like the water is originating from somewhere and not just kind of starting at the top. So the more continuancy you can have through the whole thing, the better. I'm trying to keep my lines very upright. They're not really crisscrossing each other, but if they overlap slightly, it's not a big deal. Okay, so hold that up so you can see it a little closer. You can see it's not perfect yet, but we're going to perfect it. You could leave it like that for a really quick look, but I'm going to go a step further and add more texture onto it because I think it looks a little bit too contrived right now. It looks like I just kind of laid a piece on. I want it to really look natural and to look blended into the whole thing. So what we're going to do is just take little bits of our pulled Isomalt and we're going to stretch them into tubes. So I always cut from the smooth side, not the side that has the wrinkles in it where it went together, although that does look like a really pretty waterfall, so you could put that in if you wanted to. And now there's tons of stylistic ways that you can go through about this. You can do it more ridged horizontally, so it looks like the water is lapping on top of each other. You can do it really however you want. You know, artistically, it's up to you. This is your piece. But I'm going to just add some vertical ridges because it's very fast, but it's very effective. It really gives you that look of a waterfall. Okay, so I just basically laid a thin piece on top, and I'm going to do a couple of those and then I'll hold it up to show you. So what I'm doing is I'm stretching. I'm not really rolling it like you would fondant and gum paste. I'm really just stretching it. I might roll once or twice to cool it slightly or to smooth over any dents I may have made. But I just take a piece and I stretch, cut off those wider ends. Okay, and I'm going all the way down to the pool and then laying it across the back. Now these extra pieces I'm not putting under the lamp, I'm putting them back in my liquid bowl because I don't want to mix cooler pieces back into the soft pliable Isomalt because it won't balance out, it'll just cause lumps. So Isomalt always goes back under the lamp and then the extra pieces go into the bowl at the end. Okay, so I'm just pulling, and it's okay if these aren't perfect, it's probably even better because it adds a lot more variegation. Again, it depends on your style. If you want it to look a little bit more crazy, if you want it to look a little bit more streamlined. I'm going to add one more to the side, and you can use these to widen certain sections. There's no rule that says it has to go from the pool all the way to the back. It can stop halfway up because we're going to blend this in a second, so you are going to have a lot of blending that can hide seams and things. So you could trace it along the edge of your base piece like a border to clean up the edge a little bit or to add width in certain areas. Okay, so I'm going to hold this up so you can see it a little closer, what I have so far. Okay, so see, it's just a very basic start. And the more of those that you add on, of course, the more depth and texture you're going to have. So you can kind of go crazy with that. They don't take very much Isomalt, and they only take a second, so you can do as many as you like. I'm going to do some shorter ones now. Again, I usually work from larger pieces down to small details, so I'm just going to cut a couple of these, maybe have them only go halfway up, and then maybe have some start from the back and not go all the way down. And that now will add a little bit of variation. So you don't want it to look like a striped print. You don't want it to look like the lines are too perfect. So by adding some that don't follow through all the way, that stop halfway up or 3/4 of the way up, it will just add even more to it. Or maybe they don't go to the bottom and they don't go to the top. They stop halfway through. Okay, you can continue adding little bits. Wherever you want to add more depth, they can go in between some of the lines you already put down, but try not to fill in every single gap because then you're just going to end up with a flat surface again. And the whole point of adding these texture pieces on is to get away from a flat surface, to add a lot more depth to it. So try not to fill in every single deep gap that you see. Try and leave some for some depth. Okay. I'm just going to add a couple more. Maybe got it from the front here. So I'm just going to add in a couple more pieces to the bottom, the side here. I like to add them where the rock meets up to the water because I feel like that looks sometimes a little bit unrealistic since it's not going to sit against a rock exactly the same way water does. So if you can fill in some of those gaps and kind of distract your eye, it can really help. There we go. Alright. So again, add as many ridges as you would like. You can keep building it to add even more depth. Alright, I'm going to go ahead and stop there. You can see how I kept that kind of contour against the rock. It's not a perfectly straight down line. Because remember that water contours to the entire thing. It contours to whatever surface it's on. And now this is where all of the magical stuff is going to happen. So we're going to start blending and texturing. One last thing I want to do at the base is because, remember how I was talking about at the base of a water spout or a waterfall like this, it's going to get wider. It's not just going to get wider flat ways against the rock, it's going to get out. It's going to go out from the rock a little bit as far as away from the rock. So I'm going to add a little tiny piece, just a strip like we were doing before. Okay, but it's going to be a little bit thicker, and I'm going to create a slightly curved sort of banana shape and wrap it all the way around, and I do that while it's very warm and pliable so that I can now go in and just blend upwards a little bit in any dents that are already there to make it a little bit less perfect. And this is not going to look very pretty, but I promise in the end it's going to make all the difference. So I'll hold this up. So you can see what I did. See how I just added a horizontal piece. So it does have kind of a seam, but that's what we're about to get away. And then I just pushed in with my tool at any of the indents that were already created by those tubes. And that is going to add some depth. So you see how that stands away from the rock surface a little bit farther? You can even do that again with a slightly smaller tube away even more if you want to add more depth to it. Okay? Now what we're going to do is blend. So blending is really going to make all the difference in making this piece pull together. What we're going to do is bring your piece of foil back. I must have tossed mine when I was cleaning up before, but very easy to make another one. Just going to crumple that up. And this is also going to texture the waterfall. So I have my crumpled piece of foil, and I also have my silicone tools. Now if you don't have a silicone tool, you can use regular sculpting tools. Just make sure that you don't touch it to any sort of molten isomalt. You really let it cool down first before you shape this. If you have metal tools, that'll work even better than plastic, but you can use plastic again as long as you let this cool down for an extra maybe 5 or 10 seconds before you indent. Okay, now I'm just going to go over, and you can do the whole thing at once, or you can do section by section, which may be a little easier if you are newer to Isomalt because you don't maybe know how long you have to work with it yet. But I just torched over, not the fondant, just the Isomalt section. I let that sit for about 5 or 10 seconds, and what that's doing is not only cooling off the surface so my tool doesn't stick, but it's sinking the heat into the whole piece. Now if you're working fairly quickly, this is going to still be a little warm, so you won't have to torch as much. But if you had the pieces already cooled down and you're going back, you may have to do another layer of heat after this. And I'm blending, so I'm just pulling my tool, trying to go with the texture that's already there. So if there's an indent, that's where I'm tracing my tool. I'm not creating a whole new one, but you could create a whole new indent somewhere there wasn't one if you need to trick the eye or make it blend a little bit better. You can go back over if it hardens and heat it up again, wait another 5 or 10 seconds, and then do it again. But now I'm going to focus a lot on that area at the bottom where I added that horizontal piece to bulk it out. I want to make sure I don't see any sort of seam there. I'm going to actually look at it from my angle so I can see what I'm doing. The most important thing with this step that I find is you want to get rid of the edges of the tubes. So what I mean by that is on either side of a tube, it's round, right? So it's round, but it rounds at the bottom. So it may not sit flush against a flat surface like this. So I just drag my tool against the edges of each of those lines, and it just flattens it against the surface. So the top is domed, but the back of it is more flush into the whole thing. And that is going to just make sure that it looks like the water is protruding from itself instead of these tubes just laid on top. Okay, so I'm just continuing to heat little bits, blend little bits, and you could do this as long as you want, as long as you keep reheating it, giving it 5 or 10 seconds before you touch it with the tool. You could do as long as you want. There's really no time limit with this. Make sure that you look at it the perspective it's going to be seen. So if it's going to be up high on a cake, you look at it from below. So you're looking up at it, maybe either set it on something or just hold it up or get down on its level, because the perspective is going to be really important with this, how it's actually going to be viewed. All right, maybe I'm adding a couple extra ridges in here just to create some more texture. If anything looks too perfect and maybe you have like perfect gaps next to each other, you may want to add more pieces at this point, and that's totally fine. But another thing that's going to help this all to really add like a sparkle to it is going to be using the foil. So I'm going to hold this up first so that you can see the difference once I do the foil. But you see how just adding those few lines on top that really only took a couple minutes made all the difference, from making it just a semi-flat piece with some indents in it to really adding so much depth. I'm trying to hold it at an angle. You can see all the ridges I put in. Okay, so this last step is really going to add sparkle. Like I said, it's going to reflect the light in lots of different directions, and so to do that we're going to use the foil. I mainly use it where the water goes together, so where the waterfall water meets the pool, that's mainly where I'm going to do this, and not only will that blend it all together, but it will add that sparkle and that realism. You may have to shape your foil a little bit differently into like a line so that you can fit it down in there. But I'm going to wait about 10 seconds. If your foil sticks, that means you didn't wait quite long enough. And I'm going to texture it. So I'm pushing the water from the waterfall, or the Isomalt from the waterfall, down into the pool to get rid of the seam between the two so that they look natural. And then I take that crinkliness and I go out from the waterfall a little bit farther so that it looks like sort of the froth at the bottom, the mist at the bottom. Now in doing that, you don't want to lose too much of your texture in your ridges, so I'll go back after and I'll re-indent some areas so it doesn't create just a flat sparkly plane, it creates a ridged sparkly plane. And you can even go up the sides. I wouldn't necessarily do the whole thing personally, but you may want it super sparkly, and I'm just going to add in little bits of texture all over, and not only does that blend it further, but again it creates that sparkle, and it also distracts your eye a little bit, so you're not looking so much at the straight lines, you're looking at the sparkle of the light being reflected. Light is really key with Isomalt because it's going to catch the light in such unique ways. Now at any point you can add more pulled Isomalt onto this. Let's say it looks a little lopsided, let's say you wanted more depth once you saw how cool it looked with all the texture, you absolutely can do that. And you can have it going out as far as you want at the base, but I usually only do it about maybe a ½ inch to an inch. Okay, and you see that sparkle at the bottom? We're going to be painting over that in just a second, but it really just is going to create a nice blended look once we have the white froth on it. And you can see that little bit of sparkle up in the whole thing too, where it just reflects that texture. Plus it helps the whole piece to look cohesive because we used the foil on the rocks too, so. Alright, I'm pretty happy with that, so I'm going to go ahead and just let that cool. You can use your little fan to help it cool down, or you can just go ahead and start like I'm going to, because it's pretty much in place now, so it's not going anywhere. Alright, we are going to start painting, so I'm going to move this off of my Teflon mat. There we go. Now, for the we can do the ridges first, actually, before we start painting. Those are very, very quick. What we're going to do is just heat the pool. So I'm trying not to heat over anything that I textured, because that would just undo my texture. I'm going to heat pretty good. Let it sit for a good 15 to 20 seconds. So I melted the surface. I could almost see some little bubbles starting, and really, really melted it. And then I want to let that cool before I texture it. I'm going to go ahead and use a veining tool. You can use a ball tool. You can use whatever feels most natural to you. And then I'm just going to go with the shape of the waterfall. And you may have to do a little bit more heating if you find that either you didn't heat enough or you let it cool too long. But the more heating that you do, the deeper the ridges will go. And you can add as many of these as you want. But I like to do it after it's cool, like this, because then you can really shape it to the exact shape of your piece. So I do some bigger ones, some smaller ones, but I try and keep them all going the same sort of curved angle. Okay. And you see how that just adds, pick it up now that I don't have it. Oh, okay, it's on the mat, so I'm not going to let it pick up because of the fondant still drying. But you see how that adds in those ridges, and it really just pulls the whole pool into it, so it looks, again, like one movement of water rather than two pieces meeting each other. Okay. Alright, so now for a little bit of paint, we're going to start with the white. You can use lots of different types of paint for this. There's really no set way that you need to do it, but I'm going to be using my Artisan Accents gel color in Snow White and then thinning it with a little dilution solution, but it would work great if you did some petal dust mixed with alcohol or any other kind of opaque acrylic paint. I'm just only going to thin it a little because the white is pretty liquidy. Grab a little paintbrush. I had one here. Here it is. Okay, just mix that together. And I want to wipe off a lot of the paint first because I want to build this up from translucent to opaque so that it doesn't look too harsh. So I'm just kind of blotting it on a paper towel. Then I'm going to go through and I'm going to just paint that on. Okay? So I'm just tapping it over the texture, and it's going to catch on all that sparkle that we did. I'm going to bring it up a couple of the lines, but try not to make it like a perfectly straight line. Then I'm going to go with a little bit more, and it'll kind of pool in spots, which is actually good because it'll just look more and more like water. And then I'll also go through with just a little on my brush and just streak it, not trying to create a flat color, but just adding some light highlights onto the streaks, pulling it up from the bottom. I don't do too much because I want the light to naturally just look beautiful catching on the Isomalt. I want the Isomalt to do most of the work and all that texture we put in, but just adding this on helps slightly. I'm going to kind of bring it away from the texture on the bottom. And then if you wanted to, you could even highlight those ripples a little bit, like maybe there's a little bit of foam on their edges, like waves. And then I would let that dry, and you can continue adding more and more layers of the color until it is all together. Let me see if the, yeah, I'm going to let it cool or dry all the way before I pick it up, so I'll just use the mat to pick you guys up. But you see how I just added on that white? And it's still pretty translucent, which is what I wanted. So I'm just going to, here we go, now it's coming off. So I just want to let that dry and then continue. with as many layers of white until it's the translucency or opacity that you want. So it's very subtle. You can build it up to more intense if you want to. If you had a little bit of texture on the bottom, you can wait till this thing completely sets up and dries and all the fondant's dry, and you can lightly torch that away. It depends on if you're using a matte or if you're using the Teflon matte or the foil. The foil can sometimes have crinkles in it, which can look really cool. I'm going to put it on this orange one so it comes off easier when I want to pick it up. Okay, so even just drying these couple minutes, I can layer another layer on top and it's starting to stand out more. Okay, and then to shade the rocks, I just use dry petal dust. So I'm just going to grab a little bit of my Turkish black from the Sugar Art. This is their Elite color. And I'll use a mixture of puffy brushes and more like firm brushes to put this on because I want just an overall sort of catching of the texture. But then I want to really, really kind of indent and crease the deeper indents. You can add a little bit of alcohol into this if you want to make it more intense. But I'm just going to do it dry at first, and again, you can layer the colors as much as you wanted to with what kind of depth that you wanted to put in, or maybe you wanted to do more like brown rocks, then you can use a dark layer of brown. I'm of course not going to take as much time as I normally would with this, but I just want to give this an overall sort of dusting so you guys can see the finished piece. And then our last step will be our little mossy bits to add another texture into it. The whole feel of this piece is texture, and it felt like the gray and the blue match really well together, but it needed something else just to bring the whole piece into one kind of final showpiece that looked finished. So I decided to add a little bit of like a mossy foliage onto it. Okay, so see how I just did a very light sort of brushing with the black petal dust? Now I'm going to go back with a slightly firmer brush, and anywhere there's a really deep indent in between the rocks, I'm going to accentuate that with the black petal dust. And that's going to create some really deep, really pretty ridges. And it also helps to hide any seams. So if you had a seam that you realize later you forgot to blend or anything, by adding this shadow in, it really, really distracts from that and makes it really pretty. Textures are the best because you can just add more texture and it hides anything and everything. Alright. There we go. And you can already see with the lighting how much that kind of intensified the look of the piece. It just made it a lot more sharp and contrasting, and because the Isomalt looks so sharp, that's really important to have that sort of overall look on the whole piece. Alright. And, cap. Last but not least, we will make our moss. So I've done moss and grasses in different ways, but for this, I wanted it to look really glossy because this is probably in a rainforest somewhere. It's very, very wet from being right next to the waterfall, and I really wanted it to look like it's shining. And I didn't want, when I glazed it, if you were to use something like the crackers, it could take in too much of the moisture and still look matte. It'll absorb it all. So I wanted something that's going to retain its shine. So for that, we're going to use brown sugar. So it doesn't take very much, of course, depending on how much moss you want, but I just did a light brown sugar so it'll take the color really nicely. And I'm going to put a couple of drops, probably more than a couple of drops, I'm going to do a pretty good amount of airbrush color. I like airbrush, or you can use powdered color like petal dust for this, or luster dust, but I want something that's going to coat really well, so I didn't want to use gel color. And then we're just going to mix all of that up. You can leave some of the variegation of the light brown if you want to add like a more depth to it, a natural shading. But you see how that just coats over top of there. If you wanted to get really, really intricate with this, you could paint a little bit of like dry green petal dust in the places that the moss is going to be, just to make it look slightly more kind of like a depth, deep look. But I'm just going to spread this on here and there. So I'm going to grab my paintbrush that I used before with the piping gel. I'm going to attempt to open the piping gel with my slightly greasy hands now. Here we go. And you only want to use a tiny bit of piping gel. It doesn't take much because you don't want to accidentally absorb all of the moisture or all of the sugar from the moisture of it. And I'm not being too clean with this because it's going to be glazed at the end, so I kind of want this to look wet. But I'm just going to go in a couple places here. And you can go one by one as you're adding it, but I'm just going to kind of go in, especially some of the crevices. Alright, and just sprinkle a little bit on. You may get green fingers if you do it with your fingers, so you can use a paintbrush or something if you want. And I find the key with this is to not do too much. You kind of want to see between the pieces of brown sugar here, because that just makes it look like it's growing on the surface rather than clumping. Okay, and you can do lots of different colors with this depending on what kind of moss you want, but I just went for a bright green because I want it to match in with my bright blue. Okay, and then I just kind of brush some of it around so it doesn't look like little tufts. Some mosses only grow towards the light, so if you wanted to kind of put them all oriented to one side so it looks like it's growing on the side that gets the most light in wherever this waterfall is, you can. Okay, and then just brushing it all around. I'm not looking at this from the front, so of course you guys will be. You can put it wherever you think it needs it. But I just feel like that adds a little bit of that like blue-green tone into the finished piece and pulls the gray in really well and breaks it up even more. Okay, so I'm going to wipe my hands off first, get this green off of my thumb. Alright, and then I'll hold it up so you guys can see. If you have any questions, how are you guys doing if you're following along? Alright, just dry my hands so I don't get any moisture on it. And now the final step, of course, with Isomalt is going to be glazing it. So I use the clear edible glaze spray over my finished piece, so I move all my tools, I cover my surface to make sure that none of the spray is going to get anywhere, because it doesn't like to come off very easy, so I just put some plastic down or some paper down and glaze this, and this will not only lock out the moisture and humidity from the Isomalt and keep the Isomalt looking really nice and shiny, but this will actually also make your rocks look really shiny. So if you didn't want your rocks shiny, you can cover them up before you glaze with some paper towels or parchment, but this actually makes the rocks look really slick, which I find is a really nice finishing touch, not only to make it all cohesive and look kind of wet, but just to add another hint of realism, because I'm assuming the rocks around the waterfall are pretty slick, pretty wet, and this just, I think, adds such a nice touch to the very end. And it'll also lock in the moss so that the moss doesn't move. So once it's all dry, you just give it a spray and then let the glaze dry and you will be done with your finished piece. So I'm going to switch my camera up to show you the finished piece so that you can see it better from this angle. Hello again. I'm going to pull it up here. And there we go. So you can see the beautiful ripples coming off of the waterfall, all that depth and that froth at the bottom. Again, I didn't do as much layering as I necessarily would on a finished piece. Just for time's sake, that's up to you guys how much you want to put into it. But I really like how it came out. You can see the moss texture just adds a really nice color pop into it. And it just adds another texture onto the whole thing. And I really love that it's translucent too, so in the pool, if you wanted to, you could put an icing image underneath it, or a Simi Isomalt transfer sheet if you wanted to keep the translucency. We have like our koi design, it's a koi pond underneath, which I don't know necessarily if it would match this environment, but it could look cool, or of course you can make your own too. So it just gives you so many different things. You could be looking through the water into like an initial or something if you wanted to customize it. So many different ways you could do it.
Sid, Marissa missed the part, the white on the water. Is it paste or dust colored mixed with alcohol?
You can do dust mixed with alcohol. That will work perfect. I used a gel color that was diluted a little bit. You can use water to dilute it, or I used the dilution solution to make it from a gel to a paint, and I just painted it on, and I'll layer that more and more with more and more opacity as it dries. So I'd let it dry, add a little more, let it dry in areas that I want more solid. But you can definitely use powder too. The reason I chose the gel over the powder is because I wanted it to look more wet, and the powder tends to dry a little bit more matte. So since I wanted to keep this watery look, I did it with liquids. Alright, What do you guys think? Are you guys gonna make your pieces? Make sure you tag me. I would love, love, love to see it. Of course, you can change up the color of the rocks. Imagine if you were doing a tiered cake even and you had this on the top, but then you continued the waterfall going down all of the tiers. You could do rocks coming out of the front of it, almost like a geode cake sort of look where it goes through the different tiers, or you can have it going off to the side. Remember, with the blending technique of heating it with the torch and using the tool to blend it, you can blend multiple pieces, so you don't have to make a whole big waterfall to put on. You could, but you can do it one tier at a time, just adding pieces, and then when you add the streaks on top, it's going to make the whole thing come together. You can put this directly on a cake, or you can do Rice Krispies like I did, or do aluminum foil or anything underneath to kind of give you some more lightweight look for showpieces. The possibilities are really endless with this one. Awesome. Yay, I'm so glad you guys like it.
And the replay will be available right after.
Yes, the replay is available right after here on my Facebook, so if you tuned in late or you want to go back and watch when you're making yours, you can watch it there, or within the next few days it'll be up on my YouTube channel and you can go back and watch there, along with all of my past Playdates. All the live streams that I do, I put on my YouTube channel after, so you can go back and watch them at any time. We do have the accessory kit that goes with this project, so it has the ice melt and the rock mold, but you can really, of course, use whatever you have in your kitchen to make everything. And then before I go, I wanted to just talk a little bit about my next live streams, because I always give you guys the announcement of what the next project is going to be here. First off, I just wanted to remind everybody that I do have another Zoom class happening on June 27th. This is a Zoom setup, so it's going to be more face-to-face, so we can actually see each other's work. We're going to be making this Gravity-Defying champagne bottle cake. I love doing this in in-person classes, so I knew it would be a fun one for our Zoom group. It's for any level, any skill level, so we're going to be making the Isomalt bottles, the bubbles, the drips, talking about structure and stability, doing the veining and the gold veining and the marbleizing of covering the cake, all of that. And we have different bottle options too, depending on if you want to do champagne bottle, beer and soda bottle, and a mini liquor bottle, and I'm going to be demonstrating all of them. So whichever one you decide to do, you'll still be learning how to make all of them, which is going to be fun. So that's on June 27th. You can go to my website, simicakes.com, to check out the accessory kits and to sign up. If you just want to use what you have, you can just sign up for the class. And then my next Playdate, just like this here on Facebook Live, it's totally free, is going to be the Splendid Isomalt Water Lily. So that is going to be on July the 9th at 2 p.m. EST. It will be right here on my Facebook live stream, just like this one. So you can use what you have. You can get the accessory kit using the mold that I am using for this, and yeah, it's going to be a great time. I'm going to be demonstrating all about how to make the leaves, the center, the water lily pad, putting it all together, and then tons of different painting techniques that you can do with this for different effects, from soft to more striking and artistic. So yeah, I hope that you guys tune in. That's totally free right here, just like this one on my Facebook on July 9th. That's a Friday at 2 p.m. EST. And if you do want to get the accessory kit, it is live now on my website, but you can just watch and use what you have and come make water lilies with me. All right, so let me move back to my camera here. All right, do you guys have any final questions?
I have a question.
Yes.
About the Torch team on Sunday.
Yes.
That we're going to have a game night.
We are, yes. Thank you for reminding me. In the Torch team, we are having a game night, one of our Simi game nights. We've been doing them every month, and it's so much fun. We're doing trivia night this month. It's totally free, and the group is totally free as well. So if you're not a part of the Simi Torch team, it is our super fun Facebook group, totally free, but you get tons of perks from special discounts and deals and free gifts every month, and we also do exclusive live streams in there with tons of different talented artists, and we're doing these game nights, which are just a blast. We've been having so much fun doing them, so I'm going to post all the details of that later today probably, so make sure that you go check that out. And yeah, definitely join, or you can send me a message if you want to, or just search Simi Torch Team to join, because it's so much fun. It's for all skill levels, so we just have a great time talking about Isomalt, asking questions, posting pictures, and you get first access to my classes and things too. So yeah, I'm super excited. If you guys have any questions, you can leave them here in the chat in these last few minutes. But if you're watching the replay, feel free to message me right here on my Facebook page, or send me an email or message on Instagram, because I'm always happy to answer questions if you're working on this project afterwards. And again, this will be on my YouTube channel and my Facebook afterwards too.
Do you have a slide for our special guests?
I do here. I don't know if I put it in here. I'm going to post it later today on the Simi Torch Team and on my page, but our next special guest for the Simi exclusive Torch Team live streams is going to be, do you have the dates on that?
I can get them.
Thank you.
Sure.
Mom will pop up the date so I don't get any of that wrong, but we've been doing exclusive live streams in the Torch Team every Friday.
So the next one, it won't be next week because we're actually teaching on the road.
Yes, yeah, next week we're not going to do one, but we have 2 more for this month since this was a Friday.
So the 18th is Marilyn from Flexi.
Yes, Marilyn is going to be doing some super innovative and awesome projects with Flexique and Isomalt. So if you haven't used Flexique, you definitely want to check it out because it is such a cool medium, and she's going to be showing us all about it.
And on the 25th is Jessie Ann.
Yay! Jessie Ann Riley is going to be demonstrating on the 25th. She is an incredible artist. She does lots of showpieces and just beautiful, beautiful work. So she gave me a sneak peek to what she's going to be demoing, and I cannot wait for you guys to see it because it's just so beautiful. It's a showpiece with Isomalt, so make sure that you tune in. Again, those are totally free, but they're exclusive to members, so you have to sign up for the group in order to go and watch, but it's going to be really, really fun.
It is.
Yay.
It's going to be a blast.
All right, I am so glad that you guys enjoyed. Thank you so much for watching. I really appreciate it, and I hope that you guys have a great rest of your weekend. Remember to tag me in pictures of this project when you recreate it, and to ask me any questions that you have afterwards. I'm always available through Messenger. And yeah, I hope you guys have a great rest of your weekend. Stay safe, everybody, and I will see you next time. Keep life sweet.